Chapter 11. Homecoming. It seemed that she had scarcely closed her eyes when she found herself being shaken awake. She arose disoriented from a strange dream, bounding lithely through the forest, her perspective low, passing easily under bramble and briar, the thrill of some chase in her breast. She was disgruntled to discover her hair thoroughly entangled in a bush as Caleb paced around the clearing, agitated, half masked in the veiled glare of the midday sun between the branches. "Are you all right?" she asked, a bit apprehensively. He seemed nearly as disturbed as when they'd first met, but his eyes were still a murky brown, with only the barest tinge of crimson. Still, he seemed somehow fragile, ready to snap, or maybe just break apart. "You seem tense," she said cautiously. "Is something wrong?" He worked his jaw before responding. "No, we're making good enough time. Better than I feared. You're not as slow as you could be. We'll be home before nightfall if we start soon." "I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment," she said lightly. "Going home can be a welcome relief, and going home can also be complicated. I know if I could go home today I would, but there would probably be some unpleasant conversations when I got there." Old guilt tugged at her as she thought of the letter she'd left Iris that last night, starting a new life with a final act of cowardice. It makes sense that going home could be hard, is all I'm saying." "Does it make sense? Do you think you understand? What could you know about it?" The words were harsh, but they lacked any real bite. They were both silent for several long moments, Kendra waiting with a small, pensive frown. "Well," he said resignedly, "I suppose you'll have to know sooner or later. If you were hoping for a warm welcome where we're going, you can forget about that right now. They won't be at all happy to see me, but if everything goes to plan, they won't see us at all." Kendra blinked. "That bad?" He laughed bitterly. "Worse, but it can't be helped." He took a shaky breath, then straightened, eyes clearer and purposeful. "I said I was going to get you through the garden, and I will. So, you just try to not stomp around too much when we get there." She chuckled. "Careful, you almost sound like a nice guy for a second there." With a surly grunt, he tossed her a plump red fruit. "Come on, human. We've still got plenty of ground to cover. Maybe you'll die of old age before we get there. That would be very convenient." Smirking, Kendra tore the fruit in two. "Come on, Adrian. Time to go," she called, looking around. But Adrian was nowhere to be found. She had not seen him this morning. Stepping with a certain degree of panic in her step, Kendra made a circuit of the campsite. She paused in relief as she circled back around to where she had been sleeping and saw a rustling in the bushes, a familiar head of jet-black hair bobbing, considering something on the ground. "There you are, Adrian," she said with relief. "You had me worried for a—" She took a stumbling step back as Adrian turned to her, blood smeared across his mouth. He was crouching low over the body of a long serpent, scales of a venomous green hue, now broken and mangled. She could see a shred of its flesh dangling from his crimson lips as he smiled up at her. Her first instinct was to cry out in shock, but she mastered it, breathing heavily. They stood now only a few paces from where she had slept beside Adrian. She was not sure what that particular breed of snake was, but knowing the garden, she had a strong suspicion that it was deadly in its own way. As grisly and dreadful as he looked, perched over his bloody kill, it was likely that he had saved her once again. She swallowed, then composed a smile. It did not cover for her unnerved shivers, but it would have to do. "How about you leave that, Adrian?" she asked. Her mouth was dry, but he stood and obeyed, walking eagerly to her side. In short order he was cleaned up, and her shakes had stopped. She offered him the other half of the fruit, and he accepted with delight, gulping cheerily. Caleb was tapping his foot impatiently, and with her strange charge in tow, Kendra followed and tried to outrun her misgivings. The second day would have been hard-pressed to be more bewildering than the first, but still, the garden seemed to leave her perpetually unsettled. Everywhere Kendra looked, there was a subtle strangeness. The woods changed quickly and regularly as they walked, each place imbued with its own peculiar character. Bright young growth stood neighbor to ancient, solemn pines, and that beside fiercely tangled scrub amid jagged stones. It seemed almost that they were walking between seasons, all stages of life thronging side by side. And every so often, structures loomed out of the shadows of the trees. Most were indistinct in the gloomy middle distance, for Caleb still steered firmly around them, but Kendra was half certain that she had made out something like a great hive that seemed almost alive with faint movements, and once a great jet-black pyramid inverted perfectly on its point. They walked for many hours, and Kendra was tired, but also oddly energized. She felt the weariness of the miles, but it came with a burning clarity. There was a strange sense of familiarity that she could not place, and for a while she tried to ask Caleb about her surroundings. She marked it as a sign of his foreboding that he did not take the opportunity to try and correct her human ignorance. Eventually she left him to his thoughts, and simply reveled in the magnificently strange landscape. The shadows were growing long again when Caleb halted a final time. The pace had been swift and stopped seldom. "We're close now." His voice came subdued and stiff. "There are a number of ways this little endeavor could develop unfortunately, so being very inconspicuous is going to be essential. Obviously, that's not one of your graces, but I'm loath to leave you behind too long. It's hard to say how long this might take, and I wouldn't be close enough to help if anything were to go awry. So just come quietly, and try not to bumble more than you must." "I do not bumble," she replied with a dignified sniff. "I can be very graceful. Well, at times." Caleb sighed, but refrained from further comment. "It's a small community, so outsiders will be noticed quickly. They'd know you're no elf the second you opened your mouth, so don't. We'll go wearing cloaks to hide our faces, and we'll proceed very directly to our destination. Just keep an eye on Adrian, make sure he doesn't wander. It should be fine," he concluded in a mutter, half to himself. "So, how bad will this be if this does develop, unfortunately?" she asked morbidly. "I mean, this is home, right? Family. I mean, no matter what, they wouldn't be all that—" She trailed off in search of a more tactful word than dangerous. "Upset?" His mouth was a grim line. "I think we'd both be happier not to find out," he said shortly. "What did you do?" She winced as she asked, though admittedly it would be far from the first time she'd stuck her nose in someone else's business. Caleb looked off towards the leaf-sieved beams of the setting sun, far away in some memory. Then he shrugged. "Nothing I regret," he said, his voice firmer, more resolute. "The details don't much matter now." He let out a breath, then tossed her a beaten traveler's cloak. "Come on. You're not going to enjoy doing this next part in the dark." As they walked on, the trees grew increasingly tall and straight, almost as if guided into shape by many years of patient hands. They were bigger than any she'd ever seen, and soon blotted out the sun. The canopy became ever denser, splayed fingers of growth coming together into a solid ceiling. Together they passed quickly between thick trunks like great living columns. At length they came to a jarring imperfection. A branch, old and gnarled, broad as a man's shoulders, and propped against one of the giants. Its length went up deep into the shadows above and out of sight. "This is how we'll be going up," Caleb declared simply. "It's the only way up to the lower branches, unless you brought a ladder." He hopped onto the branch, nimble as a goat, and scampered up its length as easily as he traversed the forest floor, until he passed into indistinct shadow. Kendra gaped as Adrian followed readily. He passed, less gracefully, perhaps, but ascended ably enough with a gangly balance. Then he, too, passed into the gloom. Kendra laid a mistrustful foot at its base. It did not so much as shake. It seemed half buried. Swallowing her nerves, she cautiously began her own climb. She had made it quite high when her misgivings were realized. After several minutes, she could see the branches above and had almost felt a spark of pride at her progress. It was not so quick as her companions, but steady enough. When part way through a step, her handhold broke with a crack. As she felt herself begin to slip backwards, she yelped and leapt up with what remained of her footing. A burst of panicked strength surged in her legs, and she launched herself far, extraordinarily further than she would have thought possible, nearly enough. Her fingers grazed that lower branch as her momentum was expended, and she began to fall. Incongruously, she felt a little disappointed. She'd nearly made it. A hand darted out from above and seized her wrist. Adrian's dark eyes peered down at her, flashing in alarm. His thin arm jerked and strained with the effort. Then Caleb leaped down beside her and pulled her roughly back where the branch lay against the trunk. "Careful! Sister, save us!" Half dragging her, they fell into a disordered pile atop the sturdy lower limbs of the tree. "I take my eyes off you for half a moment," he muttered. "Hell of a jump, though," he added grudgingly after a moment. "Well," Kendra said raggedly, her heart still hammering, "the last meal I had before all this started was a rabbit. I guess I've got a little extra hop in me just now." The rest of the climb was milder and uneventful. She felt a flush of embarrassment as both Caleb and Adrian regularly looked back to gauge her steadiness, but there were no further mishaps. At last they came to a wall of leaves, hardy and unyielding. Carefully unfolding and pushing the layers aside, Caleb slowly made a hole up to the pale light of the open sky. Twilight was falling, and the first stars awakening. Before them was what seemed merely to be another swath of treetops, but there was a subtle strangeness to it. It was incredibly lush, with innumerable flowering and fruiting branches bursting forth to catch the last cool evening rays. Level sections seemed to lead in circuitous routes around a wide area, all with leaves that seemed healthy but were nonetheless flattened, layered. Here and there, those paths could be seen encircling larger hedges of leaves that protruded up in rough boxes, rippling gently in the murmuring breeze cascading over the forest. "This is the living city," Caleb said quietly, eyes shining. "It was my home, a long time ago." After ensuring their cloaks were in place and covered their faces, Caleb hurried his companions through the hole and hastily smoothed over their point of entry. Kendra stepped curiously onto the flattened hedgerow, which gave gently with a light spring, but otherwise easily supported her weight. But she had little time to marvel. Caleb nudged her forward with urgency. They walked on. The path they followed was empty of activity, and Kendra slowly realized that the boxy structures of leaves were huts of sort. A soft glow was emitting from delicate open doorways, and at times she heard faint bubblings of conversation, the tinkling of laughter. Passing one of the huts, she started when a voice called from a little ways over her head. She looked up reflexively before covering her face again hurriedly. But it seemed that the figure took little notice. It was an old woman, clearly of elven stock, as brown and wrinkled as if carved from driftwood. She held a smoking pipe in hand and was gazing unblinkingly into the east. She spoke again in her unfamiliar language, and Kendra froze, uncertain. Then a firm hand was on her shoulder and steering her about. Caleb muttered a quick response and then directed them on, not quite pushing them. Kendra gave a gracious nod to the old woman as she was ushered away, but the little elvish woman stirred not at all from her vigil. Kendra followed her gaze. In the gathering darkness, not far off, a thick mist was settling. With a shiver, she had the unsettling realization that it was back in the direction they had come, following in their wake. Finally, they came to a great outgrowth, broader and taller than the structures Kendra had noticed before. Flared eaves hung out off of a roughly slanted roof, with white-cupped flowers hanging down, seemingly a luminous red in the fading light of the day. Branches curled up out of the canopy, intertwining and sturdy, forming clear walls amidst the living plant life. Kendra turned and saw Caleb transfixed, rigid and unblinking. Then he noticed her watching and cleared his throat. "Come, we're here." He pulled aside a shaggy curtain of vines and leaves that she had taken for another part of the wall and held it open. With a small thrill of trepidation, she stepped inside. In that smaller, covered space, she froze as she was gripped with a sudden familiarity. It was wrong in a multitude of small details. The smell of musty paper was mostly subsumed by the faint green tang of sap and pollen, and Kendra saw clearly now that the white flowers did give off a light of their own, for the room was windowless. But it was unmistakably a library, nonetheless. An overwhelming nostalgia and delight held her paralyzed for several long moments. The shelves ran down the length of the hall, carefully arrayed with thousands of parcels, scrolls, leather-bound books, and other objects, strange and of unknown provenance. "Welcome," Caleb said quietly behind her, "to the lost library of my people." There was a fierce pride in his voice, and a tenderness. Then he was moving again, quickly, and Kendra stopped her gawking and made to follow. His pace was quick and certain as he passed down the narrow rows. Kendra came slowly after him, reverently trying to avoid bumping against anything. Like everything in the village, the shelves seemed to be alive, grown rather than cut. On closer inspection, many of the items on display were clearly ancient, with edges yellowed and delicate. She half held her breath while passing them. Indeed, it was all she could do to hold herself back from stopping and staring. Caleb was already working in the back, carefully transferring papers off of a shelf onto a carven disc of wood under a large cluster of the glowing flowers. Honeysuckle, maybe. A sweet scent wafted in the air below them. The surface of the table was raised barely above the greenery of the floor, which gave gently as Caleb kneeled. His hands moved with steady certainty, barely looking where he was reaching, brows heavy in thought. "You look like you know your way around," Kendra observed, impressed. "I was pretty distracted just trying to make my way past all this." "I do know this place well, and it is understandable to be overwhelmed. There is the richness of ages in this room." His hands continued moving across the shelves as he spoke, seemingly almost without thinking. "I spent many hours at this table, once upon a time. It was, and is, still the duty of every elf to preserve and guard such troves of knowledge. I have something of a gift for transcription, and even when my work was done, I would stay here and read the night away sometimes." His eyes were distant, melancholy. "You too?" Caleb blinked, startled from his brooding. "My aunt would always get very upset with me when she found me sleeping in our library back home, curled up over some book. Our library was nothing so grand as this, but still it has me a little homesick." "I know the feeling," he said, a little huskily. She offered him a smile. "It is very beautiful," she said, voice small in the long rows, high above the ground, untold miles from home. Caleb exhaled, then returned her smile, genuine and peaceful as she'd never seen in him before. "It is," he replied simply. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed a small pile of fragile papers towards her. "Look in here," he said. "We want a map that shows everything in the garden down to the tiers in the south, preferably with notations and references." His hands twitched slightly as she reached out to open a book. "They're quite old," he said, a little pained. She nodded her understanding, and with great gentleness they began to read together in companionable silence. It was not all in her native tongue, and that which was had an archaic feel to it, as a mother dialect long out of use. Kendra was not sure how much assistance she was actually providing. She worked through it slowly, turning the pages gingerly. Every now and then she found herself pausing, engrossed, as she read accounts, some of them seemingly first-hand, of histories long in contention by modern scholars. Wide-eyed and rapt, the hours slipped away from her. Some unknown time later, after her eyes had grown heavy and her posture slumped, Kendra saw it. The book was heavy, written in a tight, spidery script, seemingly primarily about architecture. It was a highly detailed work, including calculations, illustrations of strange monuments and features, and expansive explanations of function, material, and construction. More than a little overwhelmed, Kendra began to idly leaf through, when a few of the illustrations caught her eye. They were stylized, without scale, and focusing mainly on the particulars of certain structures, but in places they seemed to show others in relation to the focal point of interest on any given page. As she flipped through it with rising interest, common places and symbols began to become apparent, giving a sense of vague, meandering direction. And deep into the account, a statue of two women stood over a great lake, one tall and proud, the other round and pleasant-faced. Kendra took several long moments in finding her voice, cracked and dry after hours of silence. "Caleb, take a look at—" Somewhere nearby, there was a gasp, and the thud of something dropping. Adrian, who had been dozing at her knee, was up in an instant, eyes sharp and searching, vibrating with sudden energy. Caleb looked as if he was being strangled, muscles tensed, breathless. For her own part, almost on instinct, Kendra closed the book quickly and slipped it into her bag. Stepping hesitantly around the shelves of a nearby row, a lean figure stepped looked into the faint glow of the hanging flowers. Kendra's breath caught. The woman was as fair and elegant as a wild rose, features porcelain and composed, if now somewhat startled. It took several moments for Kendra to realize that she too was an elf, though unlike Caleb in many ways. Her skin was burnished to a sun-kissed brown, darker than him by far, and her clawed fingers were neatly trimmed, clutching a journal to her breast. Where he was unkempt and rough, she was smooth and groomed. But most striking of all were the eyes, piercing gold, wide and luminous. She was staring past Kendra and Adrian, eyes locked in pained disbelief. Caleb returned her gaze, turbulently defiant. The moment hung breathlessly locked between them for several heartbeats before she broke the silence.
"Caleb, is that really you?"
Caleb sighed. "Hello, little sister.